This video is being made in response to a ton of questions I get all the time in regards to the value of the BizonBox 3 and 2S. In my opinion, the short and sweet of it is that it's absolutely worth it because it saves you a ton of time. I also get a lot of comments in these videos saying that it's overpriced and I can build it for cheaper and have it all done in the same setup, but they're missing one key element, or actually a couple key elements that I hope to discuss with you in this video. The first is time factor. It takes a lot of time to build your own and set it up and get in terminal and dink around and do all that type of stuff. And then it gets ruined with the next Apple security update and you have to go back and redo that. With the BizonBox, you absolutely have no business in terminal. It's a preference pane. You click enable, activate, a reboot, and then the GPU is recognized. And this is always the case even with Apple security updates, which is a good thing, because if you build your own and you have it set up, you tend to not update because you have to go in and kind of tinker around in terminal to get it to work again. BizonBox protects you here because you can download and update those important security updates protecting your system, and in turn you continue to get to use your eGPU, which to me is probably the best and most important reason why I continue to use the BizonBox 3. The next reason is that Bison Tech has phenomenal customer support. I literally emailed a support ticket in like late one Sunday night, and it was a holiday weekend, and in 2 hours time the support got back to me with a solution to the issue that I was having. And along the lines of I can build my own at a cheaper cost. Yeah, that's cool and all, and I totally get those people that like to spend time tinkering around, but that's not my primary use, and I like to get to editing and using my system to accelerate my time savings. And that's what the BizonBox 3 does for me. So if you're a cross-platform type of worker and you have multiple laptops and you like to dock them, I would highly recommend that you consider looking into the BizonBox setup, because I can literally plug in a Windows machine and accelerate my workflow. Additionally, I can do the same thing to the Mac OS, and that is at value added in my opinion. Ultimately, the cost of the enclosure to me is absolutely worth it because of 1, time savings, 2, customer support, and 3, the options available to me in using this system. I'm not limited to Windows, and I don't have to spend a bunch of time in terminal or command prompt and linking this type of thing. And that is huge because time is a resource that cannot be replenished. And I'd rather spend an extra couple $100, $200 or $300, and get a system that will work reliably all the time and won't add, complications to my workflow. NVIDIA released beta drivers a couple of months ago that allow macOS users to take advantage of their desktop grade graphics solutions 10 series cards. So the GTX 1050 and above. I've been using the GTX 1060 and 1080 Ti and measuring the two for the past, 6 weeks or so. So I did some testing on a 13-inch MacBook Pro with Touch Bar, and it's a baseline model with bumped up RAM, so it has 16 gigs of RAM. Additionally, I tested the Mac Pro with D500s, and it's a 12-core system. With that, I want to get into some numbers and recommend to you a certain purchase pathway that will get you the highest return on your investment if you work in a similar environment that I do. So without any further ado, let's hop into some numbers. I tested some synthetic benchmarks with my 13-inch MacBook Pro with Touch Bar and my Mac Pro. The 13-inch is a 2.9 gigahertz dual-core Core i5 baseline model with a bump in the RAM, so I went with 16 gigs instead of 8, and this system only has Intel Iris Graphics 550 available to it. So kicking it right off with the synthetic benchmarks, the integrated graphics on Geekbench 4 provided a 30,328 with the compute benchmark with OpenCL, and the GTX 1060 provided a significant bump with 147,165 with CUDA acceleration enabled, and the GTX 1080 Ti had a 232,231 with CUDA acceleration enabled. Now on to Cinebench R15 with the integrated graphics. I got a 39.95 frames per second with OpenCL. The GTX 1060 provided almost double that at 68.13 with OpenCL. The GTX 1080 Ti only did a fraction better than the 1060 with a 69.17 frames per second. Before we move into Unigine Heaven benchmark, to kind of give you an idea of how gaming performed on these two systems, I did two types of testing on this because I did run all of my Unigine Heaven benchmarking through my LG 31MU97 4K display. So right off the bat, the Intel Iris Graphics 550 produced a score of 500. Moving into the benchmark on the actual display comes almost exactly the same because it gave me a score of 506, and that's the GTX 1060. Now bumping the resolution down to the 1680 by 1050, which was benchmarked on the internal display, and this score went through the roof, scoring a 2509. So I did the same thing with the GTX 1080 Ti, and on the 4K display scored a really respectable 933. Keep in mind this is a 4096 by 2160 resolution display. So bumping it into the 1680 by 1050 resolution, it scored almost the same as the GTX 1060 at a 2592. Huge performance when you're considering gaming, even in macOS. Now onto some practical use cases, and those of you that know me, I am an Adobe Creative Cloud user, so I use the Adobe suite of applications. I tested this on a 1-minute sequence with warp stabilizer, transitions, color correction, and directly linked After Effects elements within this sequence. The Premiere render, the time in seconds on the integrated graphics took 267 seconds to render out that whole sequence. The GTX 1060 did a phenomenal job at rendering that out at 99 seconds, and the GTX 1080 Ti came in just under that at 97 seconds. So queuing up that rendered sequence into Adobe Media Encoder and applying a YouTube 4K preset onto it within AME, the integrated graphics completed that export in 12 minutes and 16 seconds. The GTX 1060 did it in 8 minutes and 52 seconds. And the GTX 1080 Ti did that in 8 minutes and 37 seconds. My final benchmark, which I do a ton of because I use proxies within Adobe Premiere, is Adobe Media Encoder's ability to transcode a compressed file format. So that recently exported video that I just finished, I dumped it back in, applied a Cineform 10-bit preset to it, and ran that, and within the integrated graphics I did that task in 141 seconds. The GTX 1060 produced 126 seconds completion time, and the GTX 1080 Ti did a little bit better at 126 seconds. Here's where the fun begins. I didn't do any testing with Unigine Heaven on my Mac Pro, but I did do some synthetic benchmarks with Geekbench 4 and Cinebench R15. The D500s produced a 72,555 OpenCL score in Geekbench 4. The GTX 1060 did 139,324 with CUDA acceleration enabled. The GTX 1080 Ti did a 242,269 with CUDA acceleration enabled. Cinebench R15 produced some interesting results with the D500s giving a 69.79 frames per second with OpenCL. The GTX 1060, 64.62 frames per second with OpenCL. And the GTX 1080 Ti at 64.54 frames per second with OpenCL. Before we get into benchmarking the same exact sequence that we did on the MacBook Pro on the Mac Pro, I want to preface this portion by saying that I am running the eGPU through Thunderbolt 2, so there is significant bottlenecking occurring here. And this is no reflection of the performance of the GTX 1060 or the GTX 1080 Ti. So now with that said, let's talk about the Premiere rendering of that sequence, the same exact sequence that I did on the MacBook Pro. The D500s rendered that out in 41 seconds. The GTX 1060 did it in 53 seconds. And the GTX 1080 Ti did it slower than the D500s as well, coming in at 43 seconds. The Adobe Media Encoder export, they all performed extremely well. The D500s exported that 1-minute clip in 2 minutes and 21 seconds. The GTX 1060, 2 minutes and 23 seconds, and the GTX 1080 Ti at 2 minutes and 16 seconds. Put that video back in to Adobe Media Encoder and transcoded into Cineform. The D500s did it in 30 seconds. The GTX 1060 did it in 30 seconds as well, and the 1080 Ti did it in 28 seconds. So what is to learn of this? Well, the interface on the Mac Pro is extremely outdated, and there is no way for the actual BizonBox to produce the full throughput of the GPU that you're using. So just keep that in mind, and that's why I recommend to everybody considering the eGPU from BizonTech to go with the BizonBox 3 so you can future-proof your interface on your system, because I am here to tell you and verify with you that the BizonBox 3 does indeed work with the outdated late 2013 Mac Pro. So the results I realized are extremely surprising, and I think it's due to NVIDIA's beta driver status of these two cards. Because you would think the GTX 1080 Ti would actually blow the 1060 out of the water. And I thought it was a throughput situation, and it is when you consider Thunderbolt 2, but Thunderbolt 3 is about 90% of the actual throughput because of its 40 gigabits per second capability. And my recommendation to you at the time of this video, and if you work in a similar environment than I do, so if you're in Adobe Premiere and After Effects and Photoshop, would be that you get the BizonBox 3, even if you have a Mac Pro, because you can adapt it using the adapter and still use the system, and you kind of future-proof it, and get the GTX 1060 because I got it at a fraction of the cost. Got a deal on the GTX 1060 and I got it for about $220. If you're interested in pricing and availability for the GPUs and BizonBox 2S and 3, that will all be linked in the description. Before I close, there's really nothing I need to disclose because I wasn't paid for this video or anything. I just been getting a ton of questions on the actual value of this system, so I thought I would address it. Because in my opinion, the time savings that you realize across all of your workflow, if you are somebody that works in a similar environment than myself, and you want to do some gaming on the side, this system by far is absolutely worth it, and I highly recommend it to you. Well, that about does it for me in this one. If you like this video, please feel free to give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, you know what to do. Thank you for taking the time to watch. I am Tomas, and I will catch you in the next one.